Professor Emeritus in anthropology from Bristol University, Vieda Skultans, and she is also senior researcher at Institute of Philosophy and Sociology at University of Latvia in this project under which we are carrying this conference about these narratives from generations and their transfer. Okay, good. Please, Vieda,
Okay.
we are ready to listen to you.
You may be ready. I'm never ready. Anyway, thank you so much for letting me be part of this wonderful group. When I have problems in formulating my thoughts, I always start in the most simple way. So our project deals with the movement of memory across generations, with the emphasis on movement. We trace that movement by analyzing the life narratives of different generations, especially where these generations belong to the same family, as we saw in some of the presentations yesterday. The narrative perspective means that we try to identify not only what is and what is not passed on from one generation to the next, but also the linguistic turns used to facilitate such transmissions. In other words, as true narratologists, we are interested in both content and form. However, although our work was initially formulated with these goals in mind, of necessity, the project found itself formulating the questions raised by the literature in other fields. The literature, as Ludmila mentioned, the literature on forgetting, on sites of memory, or lieux de mémoire, on the implications of the deterritorialization of identity, and not least, rather, on the definition and constitution of generation itself, as Edmunds so ably showed us yesterday. So first, let me consider the importance of forgetting and its relationship to sites of memory. Pierre Nora famously has argued that sites of memory have become so important because the milieu of memory, that is, the emotional, spiritual, and traditional environments, no longer exist. This has been described as the artificial reconstruction of postmodern memory sites, divorced from any organic community of remembrance. Nora argues that sites of memory achieve importance when the traditions of passing memory from one generation to another disappear. In other words, when lieu, that is places, replace milieu, that is environments, traditions, settings. Modern society, he argues, requires physical sites of memory because taken for granted beliefs and commemorative practices have disappeared. He writes famously, "We speak so much of memory because there is so little of it left." Communities of memory which relied on extended families and unbroken links between generations have disappeared, at least in France, which is what he is writing about. In fact, his 7-volume work is, if you like, a hymn to French national identity. Does the insistence that ours is an era of forgetting suggest new ways in which we should approach and examine our archival material across multiple generations? Is all erased in the process of moving forward and forging new identities in changed historical circumstances? Does Eastern Europe, and Latvia in particular, experience the same separation between lieu and milieu that Pierre Nora found in late 20th century France? Or may it be the case that the Baltic countries, that in the Baltic countries, sites of memory actually serve to reinforce traditions of remembering and thereby also the links between generations? I'm reminded, I can't remember who wrote this, but I'm reminded of someone who raised the absurdity of a bystander standing in Trafalgar Square and crying over the death of Nelson. That, in a sense, is an instance of the erasure of memory. Whereas if we go to any memorial event in the Baltic countries, we will actually find people crying in the process of the commemoration. So what does the fierce contestation over the actual siting of these sites mean? Where should the commemorative wagon train that transported farmers to Siberia in 1948, where should that be sited? It certainly indicates that the German philosophical writer Musil's famous observation is not universally applicable. He wrote, if you remember, that the remarkable thing about monuments is that one does not notice them. There is nothing in the world so invisible as a monument. But it is an irony that memory studies have blossomed precisely since Pierre Nora announced the death of memory in 1981. A precondition for the death of memory is forgetting, which Ludmila raised yesterday. And this is a topic taken up by that wonderful writer, Paul Connaughton. Connaughton argues that sites of memory achieve importance when the traditions of passing memory from one generation to another disappear. In other words, when places replace traditions of memory. So modern society, he argues, requires the physical sites precisely because commemorative practices have disappeared. As I quoted before, Nora wrote that we speak so much of memory because there's so little of it left. Paul Connaughton is known to most of us for his writing on social memory. More specifically, his highly influential and much quoted book, How Societies Remember. However, forgetting is found on the reverse side of the coin that features remembering on the other side. And Connaughton subsequently went on to explore the link between modernity and forgetting. Sadly, he passed away, so I learned just recently. He passed away just a few years ago. But in his book on forgetting, he presents us with a finely nuanced picture of a situation where, put simply, not all forgetting is bad. He has a chapter in that book on 7 types of forgetting. And he singles out the forgetting which is entailed in the formation of a new identity, which is not so much the loss involved in being unable to retain certain things, as rather the gain that accrues to those who know how to discard memories that serve no practical purpose. No practical purpose in the management of one's current identity and ongoing purposes. Connaughton also quotes from Renan's lecture of 1882, What is a Nation?, to concur with his claim that shared amnesia is at least as essential for the development of what we now consider a nation as is the ability to invoke common memories. Indeed, Renan represented the nation as a daily plebiscite. A daily plebiscite is, of course, necessary precisely in circumstances where memory is absent, where we cannot remember what we committed to earlier. So we have to renew this plebiscite on a daily basis. But there are certain specific features of modernity that Connaughton singles out as most strongly associated with forgetfulness. He refers to these as certain kinds of temporalities, institutionalized and organized time schedules, and he identifies 4 temporalities as promoting a loss of memory. These are the temporality of the labor process, the temporality of consumption, the temporality of career structures, and the temporality of information and media production, of which today we're a part. In the modern world, work is spasmodic. Fashions and desirability of consumer goods change at accelerated rates. Careers involve movement. The internet moves forward on inbuilt obsolescence. In each case, Connaughton writes, I want to suggest that the specific type of modern temporality entails an abbreviation of history and a corresponding form of cultural forgetting. Connaughton's extensive and detailed exposition of these temporalities is both nuanced and convincing, but my purpose in introducing them is to ask what approaches they might suggest for our study of transgenerational memory transmission. Can we identify environments which are free of these temporal environments and which therefore nurture remembrance rather than forgetting? In trying to answer this question, we need to bear in mind what Connaughton posits as the sources of significance. The meaning of life is based on shared memories, and that meaning is being eroded by a structural transformation in the life space of modernity. Let me just open the door because my cat is scratching it.
It's even better because Molly Andrews also is trying to connect she
Okay, so a good pause.
Yeah, we are also waiting for Molly to get in.
Edmund, I will email Molly. Maybe she has the wrong link from yesterday or so.
Yeah, I just wrote it.
Oh, you wrote?
Yeah, a second ago. I sent her a link, so we can for a while. But of course you can continue, Vieda, please.
Okay, so yeah, I found Connaughton's book on forgetting very moving myself. So to move on to the work of the ethnographic work of Monica Palmberger that Edmunds and Kaspars have dealt with at great depth. Palmberger spent 3 years in Mostar in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and she provides a good start for attempting to answer some of the questions that I've just raised. She shows how remembrance is important for constructing the identity of the two older generations, whilst forgetting is equally important for the younger generation. She argues that the youngest generation, whom she calls the post-Yugoslavs, or interestingly, the unspoilt generation, have distanced their, quote, personal story, and to some extent that of their entire generation, from what is often described as a collective experience. In this context, Palmberger, borrowing from Connaughton, argues that forgetting should not necessarily be characterized as bad and remembering as good. Her study is in many ways groundbreaking, identifying as it does the overarching importance of generation against ethnicity. What she found was that generation was an overarching concept that united younger people of several different ethnic backgrounds. But what she doesn't do, to my mind, is address the role of family dynamics in the process of remembering. To what extent, I would like to ask, do the experiences and memories of parents shape the identities of their children? And here we're helped at arriving at answers by looking at the writing, and I wish that Molly was here for this. By looking at the writing. Oh, you're there. I just can't see you. Oh,
yeah, I'm sorry.
Hi.
I lost the link for it. I didn't know it was a different link for today. My apologies.
Okay. Anyway, lovely to see you again. Yeah, I was. Did you hear the bit about Palmberger and Bosnia?
I've only just joined. I'm so
All right,
sorry.
okay. Okay, well, Palmberger identified 3 generations in Mostar in Bosnia-Herzegovina, where for the older 2 generations, they connected with a collective memory, but where what she calls the unspoilt generation, the younger generation, do not connect their personal story to a collective experience. And my point is that, you know, her work is extremely fruitful but that what she doesn't address is the family dynamics in the process of remembering, and the extent to which the experience and memories of the parents shape the identities of their children. And here I move on to the writing on German guilt and recollection of the Holocaust. The importance of the family in the transmission of memory, or its failure, is most starkly illustrated in the German literature, which is quite vast. But I'm just going to refer to the work of a psychoanalyst, Alexander Mitscherlich, who in 1963, and the 60s, I think, were a critical decade for the opening up of memory in Germany, wrote a book called Auf dem Weg der vaterlosen Generation, which was translated into English as Society Without the Father, a contribution to social psychology. And Mitscherlich characterized his generation of Germans as fatherless. Mitscherlich was a psychoanalyst, and he was foremost and instrumental in reinstating psychoanalysis, both as an intellectual discipline, but also as clinical practice in Germany after its total eradication under the National Socialists. And his psychoanalytic lens was trained on helping to understand social and historical phenomena. His work made explicit and public the rift between the post-generation and the earlier generation who'd lived through the Nazi-dominated period and the war. This silence he described as the inability to mourn, and indeed he's got a book which is translated as The Inability to Mourn. And he argued that the events of the earlier lives of the older generation of the parents contaminated and ultimately put an end to any communication between fathers and children, especially fathers and sons. Society Without the Father evoked a huge response among the reading public and indeed acquired a cult status. It resonated with the post-war generation of Germans nationwide because it reflected what had been happening in so many families and could not hitherto be said. It sought answers to the question, is it possible that this present is not livable because of the fact that it is still in the shadow of a sinister past? The response to Mitscherlich's book was, if you like, an earlier version of the Me Too movement. And I can't remember the name of the movement that's very powerful now in the Western world, which looks at the false identities of masculinity and the problems that men are confronted with by this. So my question relating back to our own work is, what does the German experience tell us about potential obstacles to the transmission of memories across generations? What happens to intergenerational communication when there are dubious and morally unresolved issues in the past. The writing on the Holocaust has in many ways been pivotal in stimulating the growth of the subdiscipline of memory studies, but more specifically in understanding the impact of trauma on the shape of memory and its erasure. A landmark in the literature was the publication in '92, a note that these publications are quite late in the day. They come several decades after the actual existence of the Holocaust. So in '92, Testimony, Crises of Witnessing in Literature, Psychoanalysis and History was published, written by Shoshana Fellman, a literary theorist, and Dori Laub, a psychoanalyst. The thrust of their argument is that the traumatic experience is beyond the imaginable and therefore becomes erased or absence. We live in an eternal present of modernity because the idea of history as a source of nourishment has become useless. The traumatic event, and this is a quote from them, becomes an absent experience. And I have to include this example, although I'm not sure how relevant it is, but an interesting and very telling example of this psychological process is provided by the following event. A decade after the end of World War II, when West Germany was dismantling its refugee camps, an agreement was reached that Israel would accept and hospitalize a shipload of 1,500 Jews with psychiatric illness. Virtually all of them, when they arrived in Israel, received a diagnosis of schizophrenia. The image, we talked about images yesterday, but the image that's conjured up is reanimates the image that Foucault presented us with of the ship of fools, rudderless. Although in this case they weren't rudderless, they ended up in Israel. Dori Laub carried out his research with these patients in the early years of the 21st century. Some 750 of these patients were still alive, and Laub carried out interviews which aimed, in his words, to probe the limits of testimony in those who'd given up on communicating with others. Interestingly, he didn't find any symptoms of schizophrenia. Bear in mind that he was a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, so he was skilled at recognizing these symptoms. What he did find was an absence of the memory of past events. Whereas in his earlier work with survivors, he'd found that when appropriate conditions of listening are created, testimony begins to have a life of its own. In the case of these survivors with psychotic illness, this does not take place. In both cases, there is an erasure of past experience, but in the latter case, the memories cannot be restored. It's interesting that following on from that work on Holocaust memories, the work on traumatic memories exploded. Kathy Carruth, a few years later in '95, brought out a volume on trauma, which is a fine example extending the scope of work to Vietnam, the AIDS epidemic, and other sources. So the literature on Holocaust remembrance has enlarged and energized the work on understanding of trauma and memory. And important for us to bear in mind that in the case of our older informants, we are facilitating witnessing. However, although trauma so often disappears under erasure, its power to maim later generations does not disappear. Indeed, concealment appears to add to its power. And here, very important, is the work of two French psychoanalysts of Hungarian Jewish origin, namely Nicholas Abraham and Maria Torok, whose work was first published in 1978 in French, L'écorce et le noyau, translated into English only in 94 as The Shell and the Kernel. And in their work, they document the haunting legacy of trauma on later generations. However, unlike Freud, who argued that his patients' alleged traumas were imaginary, notoriously, Freud decided that his female patients who alleged childhood sexual abuse, that they were lying, to put it bluntly, or fantasizing. Unlike Freud, these two, Abraham and Torok, following the Hungarian psychoanalyst Ferenczi, argue that the trauma was real. But what is interesting is that both victims and perpetrators pass on the ineradicable legacy of violent histories through generations. In other words, both children of Holocaust victims and the children of Nazi perpetrators suffer. And our awareness of this literature has enabled us to seek and identify both encrypted silences and transgenerational hauntings in our own project. Another very important dimension of the Holocaust literature is its move towards globalization. More recent work by two sociologists, Levy and Schneider, highlight how the Holocaust has become a universal moral yardstick that breaks down national boundaries. They write, the Holocaust has become a moral certainty that stretches across national boundaries and unites other parts of the world. This has led to a larger transnational and cosmopolitan memory culture and moral community. And this has relevance for our research, for the global, for paying attention, looking out for both the global and the local in the life narratives of our respondents. So I now want to move sideways and look at the way in which our study of memory transmission across generations, so our vertical study, also benefits by drawing upon the theoretical debates in migration studies. To oversimplify, migration studies focus on horizontal movement, whereas generation studies are focused on vertical movement. But that's not to say that we have nothing to learn from the horizontal movement of migration studies. Does movement involve taking into account what we have left behind, as well as what we look forward to? More specifically, the question crystallizes around what has been called sedentarism. A straightforward version of sedentarism is provided by Janssen and Löfving. According to a sedentarist logic, human beings are seen not only as being collectively rooted in a particular place, but also as deriving their meaningfulness or their culture from this very rootedness. Conversely, there is a pathologization of uprootedness. Homelessness is a well-nigh universal experience if, as the anthropologist Lisa Malky states, people are chronically mobile and routinely displaced. Identity is constructed with supra-local and indeed global cultural images of the international community. Malky, in her much-cited ethnographic study of the displaced Hutu in Tanzania, found an important difference between the Hutu that were dispersed in the township of Kigomo and those living among their fellow tribespeople in refugee camps. Whereas the urban Hutu do not see their identity as exclusively bound up with lost homelands, but rather see themselves as the exiled true citizens of the moral community. The camp dwellers, by contrast, see their identity as intimately bound up with the land they have lost. Thus, if you like, the town Hutus are true internationalists, in contrast to their backward-looking, recidivist rural brethren. Malky's work has been hugely quoted and hugely influential, but she's received serious criticism from the economic historian Gaib Kibrayab, himself of Eritrean origin, and therefore very personally involved with the experience of refugeedom, and also a professor at the South Bank University in London. He challenges the idea that the globalization process has led to a deterritorialization of identity. I'm sorry, all these studies have these very long words that I find increasingly difficult as I get older. He argues that the town Hutu downplay their Hutu identity and their connection to lost lands because of the precariousness and vulnerability of their position as refugees. They do not want to draw attention to themselves. Kibrayab points out that one's rights as a human being are not defined and granted by a global passport. Such a thing does not exist. But by a passport that recognizes national belonging. The generalized condition of homelessness, he argues, is a spiritual, even a metaphysical condition that is far removed from the physical and psychological dangers and deprivations endured by present-day migrants and refugees. The stimulus for anti-sedentarist arguments draws upon earlier, strongly held convictions about exile, return, and home. Ovid, exiled from Rome to the Black Sea coast, is perhaps the most famous of Western exiles. A poet of genius, he was able to capture in words the pain of exile. Our native soil, he writes, draws all of us by I know not what sweetness, and never allows us to forget. Closer to our own time, the French philosopher Simone Weil, French Jewish, who during the Nazi occupation of France escaped first to America and then came to England as a refugee and died and is buried in Kent, very close to where my mum used to live. She devoted an entire book to the topic of l'enracinement, translated into English as the need for roots. And there she wrote, to be rooted is perhaps the most important and least recognized need of the human soul. For many literary theorists, place and home have huge emotive values. For example, much more recently, Julia Crete, a professor at the University of Toronto, reworking Nora's arguments about places of memory, claims that memory always seeks its local habitation. She also writes, memory attaches itself to sites, whereas history attaches itself to events. So this is quite contrary to Nora's arguments that sites of memory become important precisely because we are losing memory. In our reflection on archived interviews, in our recent and in our planned projected interviews, we are sensitive to continuities and ruptures in the life histories of successive generations. We're on the lookout for the suppression of events which might give rise to cognitive dissonance and the haunting across generations uncovered by psychoanalysts. We find the huge holes left by the unsaid, the transmission of trauma across generations, but also the determination to start afresh and build new identities. Exemplars of what Palmberger describes as the unspoiled generation can be found in post-Soviet Latvia as well as in post-Soviet Yugoslavia. Pierre Nora's milieu de mémoire, or communities of memory, survive in areas where there's been little geographical movement save to the graveyard and back. The importance of visiting and tending graves and the devotion to biannual graveyard celebrations serve to consolidate a sense of place and communities of memory. Indeed, one of our colleagues in the University of Latvia, a historian, has devoted a wonderful book to the study of graveyard ceremonies in Latvia. And my colleagues will fill in my lapse of memory because although I know her well, I can't remember her name at the moment. In many cases, forced exile to Siberia reinforces the attachment to native locality, particularly in instances where settlement in the earlier locality was forbidden. In many cases where people came back from Siberia, they were allowed to return to Latvia on condition that they didn't live in the areas where they were born and grew up. In these communities, we expect to find a thematic and a formal continuity in life stories. The questions we pose to explore these continuities relate to the narrative templates and submerged structures in the life stories. They relate to the positioning of the narrative I. We ask the question, is the narrated self an active or passive participant in the story, or are they a bit, in quotes, player, as McIntyre wrote, where they were expecting to be the main actor? Connaughton's exploration of the features of modernity has also been hugely helpful and stimulating for our project. It's enabled us to identify the huge hiatus between the temporalities inhabited by our older and younger generations. It's also made us aware of cases where such a hiatus does not exist. Despite massive migration, Latvia is still a country where pockets of traditional kinship structures regulate lives lived and lives remembered. Malki's work with Hutu refugees subject to two types of resettlement programs found two distinct identity constructions, one linked to a lost locality, the other linked to a global moral community and a transnational identity. Her work has encouraged us to recognize the building of new identities. Benedict Anderson famously wrote about the emergence of long-distance nationalism. We've found long-distance attachment to place and past, but equally we found new identities forged. We could be witnessing what Harold Bloom, the great literary theorist, calls the anxiety of influence. We do not want to find that we are merely pale imitations of earlier heroes, heroes in most cases being our parents. Tony Yutt, the recently deceased historian, in his article on myth-making in post-war Europe, writes about two moral vocabularies, two sorts of reasoning, two different pasts. We must, of course, make room for such divergences, but equally, overriding these differences is the universal experience of human transience and the imperative need for memorialization in whatever form that is a response to this awareness of transience. Thank you very much. That's all I have to say.